My next guests were not even born in 1967, for that matter, nor was I. But we can all also reflect on the events of that summer to better understand how our lives are affected today. Please welcome Lauren Hood of Live Sex Alliance and Eric Thomas of Saga Marketing. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks for having us.
So, as I said, I wasn't born in 1967 either, but I feel like the rebellion framed my childhood in some ways. I mean, you hear it all the time from your parents, from your grandparents. There are these stories, there are these places that were affected by it, and it sort of shapes the way you think about the city for a long time. Talk about sort of that effect on you.
Well, what's interesting for me is I'm realizing that I didn't hear too much about what actually happened growing up. So everything I heard about the riot, I think, came from like school books and conversations that my white friends' parents were having, but I didn't have a real conversation with my parents about it until maybe like 10 years ago.
Wow.
And realizing that and it started because my grandmother lived on Claremont, and I just had a revelation one day. I'm like, Mom, did Grandma live on the street and she's like, yes, right at 12th Street. I'm like, how have we never had this conversation? Right. And my father's mother lived on Atkinson, right around the block. And we had never had this real talk about what actually happened. So my understanding of what really went down came much later than, you know, all those false narratives that I had heard. So I went to private school, and a lot of the things I heard about the city that were negative came from like my white parents' friends. So,
saying that this was like a turning point.
Yes, and how are you still living in Detroit, and isn't it awful there, and when is your family going to leave?
Wow.
I've had a lot of unlearning to do in the past few years.
What has that looked like, sort of going back over that ground to get a different perspective?
Well, it's something to understand that something you held on to as a truth for like part of your adult life, like childhood and part of your adult life was like totally wrong.
True.
It's not the whole story. So I still have more to learn. Like when I got asked to do this, I'm like, do I know enough about this to like be up there and be on a panel? There's so many layers, and so much of it plays into your psychology that you have no recollection of, like what you believe is possible for you, what you believe can happen in your community. Like we had a youth conversation with our org recently and like asked this young 18-year-old, like, what do you need? We're like thinking he's gonna say basketball playgrounds. He said hope and faith. So I feel like generation upon generation of people not believing that things could get better, that not believing that opportunities were for them. Like it's in this 18-year-old who just said he needed hope and faith.
Eric, you write a lot about living here in the city of Detroit, what it means to be a Detroiter. Talk about how what happened in '67 before you were born shapes your vision of Detroit today.
So I just missed '67 by 20 years, right? I was born in '87.
Only 20 years.
So I just lightly dodged the teens and winks. But you know, it's interesting. I've always been fascinated with systems. You know, how do systems impact peoples? And I've always said this thing. You know, if one fish dies, right, you check the fish. If all the fish die, you check the water, right? If you look at a city like Detroit with this much economic disparity and this much educational deficit, I've always been going, how is that possible? I mean, if you look at the story of '67, the biggest thing that doesn't make sense is, and this is the story they tell you, one day blacks went crazy. Well,
everyone lost their mind.
Absolutely not. I mean, absolutely. If you begin to look into just the history of America, I mean, if the first manned flight, right, was in 1903, right, and to space, it was in 1961, right? That means we're almost between that amount of time from people standing on the ground to getting into outer space from the '67 riots, right? If there hasn't been that much change, you have to start questioning the systems and where we are actually living.
Right. And do you feel like the Detroit that you live in today is not sufficiently changed from '67?
I live in a weird Detroit, right? I grew up on Joy Road in Greenfield in these streets, right? In the hood, if you will. But now I live in Alden Park Tower, right next to West Village. But I've always argued that I don't understand this idea of the tale of two Detroits. When I lived in the hood, there was still Palmer Park. That was two Detroits for me too.
Right.
My question is, are we more upset that there's a disparity in power and income, or we expect that it doesn't look like us anymore.
Well,
and so,
that's interesting.
I mean, like, poverty didn't change for my family. When the mortgage crisis happened, we were still poor.
Right.
In the same way as it happened, my family still live in the same house in the hood. So for me, the resurgence of Detroit, as much as you can say that, I mean, 7.2 isn't a resurgence out of 142. But it has been good for my business, but has it been good for the people that I care about? Not necessarily.
Yeah.
So.
Lauren, the work that you're doing is right around, Livernois 6 Mile, a neighborhood that represents lots of different parts of Detroit, lots of different dynamics in Detroit. Do you feel like the 67 Rebellion frames that work in any important way, or frames those neighborhoods still?
Sure. Well, one of the neighborhoods in particular, Fitzgerald, I can think of a number of elders who, when I get their origin story, I'm like, when did you come here? They're like 67. So it was one of those places that black people were allowed to live in at that time. When you were trying to get away from 12th and Claremont and move outward, it was aspirational to go to the northwest side.
Right.
So yeah, I know for at least one of the neighborhoods, that's a big part of why people are there, and a big part of why people take ownership of the place. So when you look at a neighborhood that's undergoing rapid change, and you want to know, like, why are residents so angry and why are they so nervous, and why does all that tension exist? It's because this was one of the few places they could go, and they've been there like for 50, 60 years.
Right.
There are several generations of families living on one block. So when you're like, why is this such a big deal to make change happen in this neighborhood? That's why.
Yeah. And their expectations, understandably, are for something better.
Something that includes them, first of all.
Yeah.
Right.
Don't write them out, right? Don't draw them off the map.
And a collective definition of what better is.
Yes. All right, Lauren and Eric, thank you both for being here. I think the best way to think of 1967 is in terms of both past and present. The past being what happened before the uprising, and the present being what we've learned since. I wish I could sit here and say, we did it, we won. We confronted all of the things that confounded us back then, and we beat them. But look around. Poverty, racism, other forms of inequality, they are all still with us. They all still shape this city and this region in deep and difficult ways. If we can claim anything, though, I think it's that 50 years later, so many more people seem to get it. They know what 1967 was about. They see the shadow it cast forward into 2017, and they're willing, in many instances, to talk about it, to discuss what hasn't changed, and what we have to do to be sure that change happens at some point, hopefully before another half century passes. This is one of the strongest communities I have ever known. It's resilient, tough, even unbeatable. And that's what tells me more than anything else that we can do it and that we will. That's going to do it for this special edition of American Black Journal. Our special thanks to the Joseph Walker Williams Center and the Detroit Historical Society. For more information about today's guests, you can go to AmericanBlackJournal.org, and you can always connect with us on Facebook and on Twitter. We'll see you next time.